There's a family Bible that sits in an archive in North Carolina. Inside, in careful handwriting, is a section titled Family Record of the Age of Negro Children. From 1810 to 1864, it documents 131 births. Names, dates, parentage, all recorded with the same care as the births of the slaveholders' own children. But these weren't children who would inherit land or freedom or opportunity. These were property. Human beings whose births increased their owners' wealth, whose lives were measured in market value, whose families could be torn apart at their master's whim. The man who kept this record was Bartlett Yancey, a U.S. congressman, Speaker of the North Carolina Senate, and one of his state's most respected statesmen, the Yancey family. For more than 2 centuries, that name meant something in Virginia and the Carolinas. It meant land, education, political power, and respectability. But it also meant something else. It meant dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of human beings held in bondage across multiple states. It meant families like Charles and Jackson Yancey operating slave trading businesses in Norfolk and Oxford. It meant Joel Yancey overseeing Thomas Jefferson's plantation while Jefferson wrote about slavery as a necessary evil. It meant Charles Yancey of Rockingham County, Virginia, who owned 40 enslaved people by 1850, many of whose descendants would carry the Yancey surname long after emancipation. This is the story of one American family, but it's really the story of American slavery itself, how it was built, maintained, and justified by people who saw themselves as honorable, educated, and decent. How a system of absolute brutality was sustained not just by monsters, but by respectable families keeping meticulous records in their Bibles. The Yancey story begins in England, probably around 1700, though the exact details are lost to history. What we know is that by 1704, a Charles Yancey owned 100 acres in King William County, Virginia. The Virginia colony at that time was already defined by tobacco, land acquisition, and increasingly by slavery. Virginia in the early 18th century had a rigid 3-tier class system. At the top sat the aristocracy, wealthy plantation owners with vast land holdings and large numbers of enslaved workers. At the bottom were indentured servants, both white and black, and the growing population of enslaved Africans who would never gain their freedom. In between existed the yeomanry, small to middling farmers who owned modest amounts of land and perhaps a few enslaved people. The first documented Yanceys belonged to this middle class, but they wouldn't stay there long. By 1741, Captain Charles Yancey owned 13 enslaved people according to tax records from Louisa County, Virginia. When he died in 1814, his will carefully distributed his human property among his heirs. A girl named Nanny went to his wife Mary. The will mentions other enslaved people by name. Moses, a blacksmith, went to one heir. Matt, Ben, Rachel, and her sons Bob and George went to others. Sarah, identified as Moses's mother, is mentioned. These weren't abstract numbers on a ledger. These were people with skills, with families, with lives that meant nothing before the law. And this pattern, this careful accounting and distribution of human beings as inheritance, would repeat itself through every generation of the Yancey family for the next century and a half. The Yanceys understood what every successful Virginia family understood, that in the South, wealth meant land and labor meant slavery. Through marriages, land grants, and shrewd accumulation, different branches of the family spread across Virginia and into North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and beyond. And everywhere they went, they brought slavery with them. By the early 19th century, the family had produced multiple lines, each documenting their ownership of enslaved people in census records, tax rolls, wills, and property transactions. These records reveal a pattern. The Yanceys weren't just casual slaveholders. They were integral to the slave economy, operating at every level from plantation agriculture to the domestic slave trade itself. Consider Joel Yancey, born in the 1780s in Virginia. In 1810, he owned 9 enslaved people in Barron County, Kentucky. By 1820, that number had grown to 18. But Joel Yancey's significance extends beyond these numbers. Around 1815, he became the overseer at Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's summer plantation in Bedford County, Virginia. For several years, Joel Yancey managed Jefferson's agricultural operations, supervised the enslaved workforce, and corresponded regularly with the former president about plantation management. These letters, now preserved in the Library of Congress, provide a window into how slavery actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, and they reveal uncomfortable truths about how even enlightened men like Jefferson and educated men like Yancey rationalized the system. In January 1819, Jefferson wrote to Joel Yancey with instructions about managing the enslaved women at Poplar Forest. Jefferson's language is revealing. He wrote, "I consider the labor of a breeding woman as no object, and that a child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man." In this, as in all other cases, Providence has made our interests and our duties coincide perfectly. Jefferson continued, instructing Yancey to tell the overseers that it is not their labor, but their increase which is the first consideration with us. This wasn't unusual language. This was standard plantation management. Enslaved women were explicitly valued for their reproductive capacity. Children born into slavery represented pure profit because they cost nothing to acquire and could be put to work as early as age 6 or 7, then sold for substantial sums as teenagers and adults. Jefferson's phrase, "Providence has made our interests and our duties coincide perfectly," is particularly chilling. He's arguing that enslaving people is actually moral because it's profitable, that God designed the system this way, that the slaveholder's economic interest in breeding more slaves and the moral duty to care for enslaved women and children are the same thing. It's a perfect example of how intelligent, educated men convinced themselves that systematic exploitation was actually benevolent. Joel Yancey managed this system. He oversaw the enslaved workforce at Poplar Forest, implemented Jefferson's breeding policies, and maintained the day-to-day operations of a plantation built entirely on forced labor. One incident from 1819 shows the violence inherent in the system. In October of that year, a subordinate overseer named Bowling Clark encountered an enslaved man named Billy on a Sunday, the one day enslaved people were supposed to have off. Clark ordered Billy to work. Billy refused. According to Yancey's letter to Jefferson, the encounter escalated to violence. The details are vague, but we know that Billy and 2 other enslaved men, Hercules and Gowan, were later charged with stabbing an overseer with intent to kill. Whether this was self-defense or desperate resistance, we'll never know. What we do know is that Billy was eventually transported to Louisiana and sold, torn away from his mother Hannah, who had just lost her husband and brother to an epidemic that swept through Poplar Forest that same year. Joel Yancey's letters to Jefferson about these incidents are calm, businesslike, focused on maintaining order and productivity. There's no indication he saw anything wrong with forcing people to work on their only day of rest, or separating families, or using violence to maintain control. This was simply how plantations operated. Meanwhile, in Buckingham County, Virginia, another branch of the Yancey family was building a substantial slaveholding operation. Charles Yancey owned 65 enslaved people in 1810. By 1820, that number had grown to 82. By 1850, he owned nearly 100 enslaved human beings. This wasn't a plantation. This was an industrial operation, a labor camp. 100 people living in conditions we can only imagine, working from sunup to sundown in Virginia's tobacco fields, their entire lives controlled by one man and his overseers. What did Charles Yancey do with the profits from 100 people's stolen labor? He bought more land. He educated his children. He built wealth that would pass to his descendants. And when he died, those 100 human beings were divided among his heirs like furniture. In North Carolina, the Yancey family reached its highest prominence through Bartlett Yancey. Born February 19, 1785, near what would become Yanceyville, Bartlett was the 10th child of Bartlett Yancey Sr. and Nancy Graves. His father was a semi-invalid who couldn't do physical labor, so he taught in country schools to support his large family. Young Bartlett showed exceptional intelligence. By age 15, he was teaching school himself. He attended the University of North Carolina, studied law under the prominent attorney Archibald Murphy, and was admitted to the bar in 1807. In 1813, he was elected to the United States Congress, defeating his own mentor in the election. He served 2 terms, from 1813 to 1817, chairing the Committee on Claims. He then served in the North Carolina Senate from 1817 until his death in 1828, serving as Speaker of the Senate for his entire tenure. Bartlett Yancey was respected, influential, and, by all accounts, brilliant. He advocated for internal improvements, helped create North Carolina's public school system through the Literary Fund, fought for fair representation for Western counties, and contributed to the development of the North Carolina Supreme Court. When he died suddenly in 1828 at age 42, he was mourned throughout the state. Within 5 years, the town of Caswell Courthouse was renamed Yanceyville in his honor. Later, Yancey County, with its highest peak in the Appalachian Range, would also bear his name. He's remembered as one of North Carolina's most distinguished statesmen, and he owned dozens of enslaved human beings. The 1810 census recorded Bartlett Yancey as owning 10 enslaved people. By 1820, that number had grown to 36, but the real documentation of his slaveholding comes from his family Bible, where he kept meticulous records. Under the heading Family Record of the Age of Negro Children, Yancey documented 131 births between 1810 and 1864. 131 children born into slavery, their births recorded with dates and parentage, each one representing increased wealth for the Yancey family. The names survive in fragmented records. Novel and Mary Frances, listed as parents of multiple children. Jordan, born January 3, 1833. Ellen, Madison, Anderson, Thomas, Peggy, Thornton, Sarah, Elvina, Robert, Harriet, Eliza, Hannah, Nathan. Charlotte and Martha sold years before the estate distribution. In 1851, 1852, when Bartlett's son Charles Yancey died, estate records show approximately 30 enslaved people were distributed among Charles's children. Ellen and Jordan went to daughter Mary Columbia Yancey. Madison and Anderson went to son Charles B. Yancey. Thomas and Peggy went to daughter Elizabeth. Thornton, Sarah, and Elvina went to Thomas Alexander Yancey. Robert, Harriet, and Eliza went to Anne Virginia Yancey. Hannah, Nathan, and their parents, Novel and Mary Frances, remained with the widow. These weren't abstractions. These were families, and the Yancey estate records show those families being deliberately separated and divided like furniture in a will. What's striking about Bartlett Yancey's slaveholding is how it coexisted with his public advocacy for education and internal improvements. He genuinely believed in public schooling, in building roads, and canals in developing North Carolina's infrastructure. He worked to extend fair representation to western counties. He was, by the standards of his time, a progressive politician. And none of that progress, in his mind, had anything to do with the 36 people he owned. He saw no contradiction between advocating for public education for white children while denying education to the children born on his plantation. He fought for fair representation in government while denying any representation whatsoever to the people whose labor generated his wealth. This is the cognitive dissonance that defined the slaveholding South. Men like Bartlett Yancey could be eloquent advocates for liberty, democracy, and progress, while simultaneously owning human beings. They could keep careful records of enslaved children's births in their family Bibles, right next to records of their own children's births, and never question the moral horror of that juxtaposition. But some members of the Yancey family went beyond plantation agriculture. Charles Yancey and Jackson Yancey operated as slave traders in Norfolk, Virginia, and Oxford, North Carolina. The documentation is sparse, but they appear in records as professional traders, buying and selling human beings for profit. Norfolk was a major port city and a hub for the domestic slave trade. From Norfolk, enslaved people were shipped south to the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. Oxford, North Carolina, was an inland trading center. Together, these locations formed part of the network that moved hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from the Upper South to the Lower South in the decades before the Civil War. The domestic slave trade was one of the most brutal aspects of American slavery. After 1808, when Congress banned the international slave trade, the domestic trade exploded. Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina became exporting states, sending thousands of people south every year. Enslaved people in the Upper South lived with constant fear that they or their family members would be sold south, a phrase that meant separation from everyone they loved and transportation to the harsh conditions of Deep South cotton plantations. Professional slave traders like Charles and Jackson Yancey facilitated this trade. They bought enslaved people from estates being settled, from slaveholders in debt, from anyone looking to sell. They housed their human merchandise in pens or jails, sometimes for weeks or months. Then they transported them south, either overland in coffles, chained together and forced to march hundreds of miles, or by ship from ports like Norfolk. Historian Charles Dew, who studied hundreds of letters to slave traders, found virtually no evidence of guilt, shame, or moral conflict among the traders. The business operated on the fundamental assumption of white supremacy, that black people were inferior, that enslavement was natural, and that profit justified everything. Charles and Jackson Yancey, whatever their personal thoughts, participated in this system for profit. By the 1850s, the Yancey family's slaveholdings were substantial and widespread. In Virginia alone, multiple branches of the family owned enslaved people. Charles Yancey of Rockingham County owned 40 enslaved people by 1850, with estate records from 1851-1852 showing about 30 people distributed among heirs. Samuel Yancey of Mecklenburg County, Virginia, owned 17 enslaved people in 1850. Robert Leighton Yancey of Rockingham County owned 4 in 1850. Numerous other Yanceys throughout Virginia owned smaller numbers, 2 here, 6 there, 9, 14. In Tennessee, Charles L. Yancey of Gibson County owned 22 enslaved people in 1850, with his son later stating the family had about 40 slaves total. In Mississippi, Georgia, Kentucky, Missouri, and other states, census records document Yancey family slaveholding. If you total the documented numbers across all branches, the Yancey family collectively owned hundreds of enslaved people by the eve of the Civil War. And we know some of their names. Not all, not even most, but some survived in estate records, wills, bills of sale, and freedmen's records. In Granville County, North Carolina, Phoebe and her child Bob were sold in 1801. Katie and her children Frank, Fanny, and Anna were sold in 1809. Jim was sold to Thomas Appling in 1810. Granderson was sold to William Lassiter the same year. Spencer appeared in an 1829 deed of trust. In Culpeper County, Virginia, Alfred was purchased at auction in 1843 for $515. Polly and her children are mentioned in 1850s records. Alice, daughter of Peggy, born April 1856. Connor, son of Peggy, born May 1859. Morris, son of Polly, born August 1859. Julia, daughter of Polly, born January 1859. In Gibson County, Tennessee, Betsy and Mariah are mentioned in court proceedings about Charles L. Yancey's estate. Moses, Jane, Dick, Letitia, Cassandra, and Christopher appear in Greene County, Missouri records. After emancipation, dozens of African Americans carried the Yancey surname, the only name they had, taken from the people who had owned them or their ancestors. George and Harriet Yancey of Alabama, Fayette Yancey of Mississippi, William Yancey, freed in Richmond in 1815, Isaiah and Elvira Yancey, emancipated before 1854, Charles Yancey, emancipated in 1847. These are just the names that survived in fragmentary records. For every name we have, dozens more are lost. People whose births and deaths went unrecorded, whose families were separated and forgotten, whose suffering generated wealth they would never share. The experience of slavery under the Yancey family would have varied depending on time, place, and individual circumstance, but certain patterns were universal. Enslaved people on Yancey plantations worked from sunrise to sunset, typically 9 to 12 hours per day depending on the season. In Virginia and North Carolina, they grew tobacco, corn, wheat, and other crops. They maintained buildings, roads, and fences. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for slaveholders' children. They worked as blacksmiths, carpenters, and in dozens of other skilled trades, with all profits going to their owners. They lived in small cabins, often one room housing entire families. They wore clothes provided twice a year, basic garments of rough fabric that offered little protection from cold. They ate rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses, supplemented by whatever they could grow in small garden plots during the little free time they had. They faced constant surveillance and control. Patrols roamed the roads looking for enslaved people without passes. Dogs were used to track runaways. Overseers carried whips and used them. The legal system backed all of it. An enslaved person had no legal rights, couldn't testify against a white person in court, couldn't own property, couldn't marry legally, couldn't read or write in most southern states. Their children belonged to their owners from birth. Families could be separated at any time for any reason, sold to pay debts, divided in estate settlements, or simply because an owner decided to sell. The constant threat of sale, especially being sold south, hung over every enslaved person in Virginia and North Carolina. It was psychological torture added to physical exploitation. But enslaved people resisted in countless ways, visible and invisible. They worked slowly when overseers weren't watching, collaborated to set their own pace, broke tools accidentally, and found ways to preserve their humanity within an inhuman system. Some escaped. Some fought back violently, like Billy at Poplar Forest. Most practiced daily resistance, the small acts of defiance and self-preservation that maintained their identity and culture. They sang, told stories, maintained family bonds when possible, created their own communities separate from white observation. They survived. When the Civil War came, the Yancey family, like most slaveholding families, supported the Confederacy. They sent sons to fight. They contributed money and supplies. They had everything to lose from abolition, not just their labor force, but the entire social system that placed them at the top of the hierarchy. When Confederate defeat came in 1865 and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the Yancey family's wealth evaporated. 100 years of accumulated capital, all of it based on stolen labor, simply vanished. The formerly enslaved people who had generated that wealth received nothing. No compensation, no land, no reparations. They were free, but free into a South that immediately passed black codes and began sharecropping and convict leasing systems designed to replicate slavery by other means. The Yancey family didn't disappear. They adapted. Some members retained their land and hired former slaves as laborers, paying subsistence wages. Some moved into other businesses. The family's social standing, based on generations of slaveholding, translated into ongoing influence in the post-war South. The towns and counties named for Bartlett Yancey kept his name. His reputation as a statesman remained intact. No one wrote his name out of history books because he owned 36 human beings. That was simply normal for his time and place. Even today, you can visit Yanceyville, North Carolina, or Yancey County, and see monuments to Bartlett Yancey's contributions to education and infrastructure, with minimal mention of the people he enslaved. And this is the legacy we must reckon with. The Yancey family's story isn't exceptional. That's what makes it important. They weren't the largest slaveholders. They didn't run the most brutal plantations. They weren't particularly sadistic or cruel by the standards of their time. They were ordinary, educated, respectable people who owned other human beings and saw nothing wrong with it. They kept records in their family Bibles. They distributed enslaved people in wills like any other property. They operated within a legal system that fully supported their actions. And some, like Bartlett Yancey, made genuine contributions to their states while simultaneously denying basic humanity to the people they owned. This ordinariness is crucial to understand. American slavery wasn't sustained solely by monsters and sadists, though it certainly attracted those. It was sustained by ordinary people, educated people, people who loved their own children and went to church and believed in democracy and progress. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system was profound, but it was maintained through a comprehensive ideology of white supremacy that permeated every aspect of Southern culture. White children were taught from birth that black people were inferior, suited for slavery, incapable of self-governance. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was mainstream respectable opinion, defended in churches, taught in schools, argued in Congress, and upheld by the Supreme Court. The Yancey family participated in a system that trafficked an estimated 1 million people in the domestic slave trade between 1808 and 1860. They profited from a system that separated countless families, stole the labor of generations, denied education and literacy, and used violence as a routine management tool. And when we look at the fragmentary records that survive, the names in estate inventories and census records, we're seeing only the barest outline of what this meant in human terms. Behind every name is a life, someone who was born, who loved, who suffered, who hoped, who resisted in ways large and small, who survived or didn't. Behind Jordan, born January 3, 1833, is a person we'll never fully know. Behind Novel and Mary Frances' parents is a family whose history vanished except for these few references in a slaveholder's Bible. Behind Charlotte and Martha, sold years before, is a separation, a sale, a journey to an unknown fate. The cities named after the Yanceys, the counties, the schools, the historical markers, all celebrate a family's contributions while minimizing or ignoring the source of their wealth and influence. When Bartlett Yancey advocated for public education in North Carolina, he was spending political capital generated by the 36 people who worked his land without compensation. When Charles Yancey of Buckingham County purchased more acreage, he was using profits stolen from 100 people's labor. When Charles and Jackson Yancey traded slaves in Norfolk, they were participating in one of the most brutal businesses in American history. These facts don't erase the Yanceys' contributions to infrastructure or education, but they fundamentally change how we should understand those contributions. You cannot separate the two. The progress was built on exploitation. The wealth that enabled political influence came from unpaid labor. The respectable family name was sustained by a system of absolute brutality. Today, thousands of Americans carry the Yancey surname. Some are descendants of the slaveholding family, beneficiaries of generational wealth and opportunity built on slavery. Others are descendants of the enslaved people who took that name after emancipation, bearing a permanent marker of their ancestors' bondage. Both groups exist in the same country, still dealing with slavery's legacy 160 years after abolition. The wealth gap between black and white families in America directly traces to slavery and its aftermath. The neighborhoods we live in, the schools we attend, the opportunities we have or don't have, all connect back to systems established during slavery and maintained through Jim Crow, redlining, and ongoing discrimination. The Yancey family's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It shows us that slavery wasn't just about the Jeffersons and the massive plantation owners we read about in textbooks. It was about hundreds of thousands of families like the Yanceys, spread across every southern state, each owning anywhere from 2 to 100 people, collectively creating a system so vast and so entrenched that it required a civil war to end. It shows us that the perpetrators of this system weren't monsters, but neighbors, congressmen, Bible readers, people who loved their own children while selling other people's children for profit. And it raises questions we still haven't fully answered. How do we remember people who made genuine contributions to their communities while committing grave moral wrongs? How do we honor the good without erasing the evil? What do we owe to the descendants of enslaved people whose ancestors' stolen labor built wealth that still benefits people today? How do we reckon with systems of oppression that weren't just individual bad actors but entire legal and social structures that everyone participated in? There are no easy answers, but the first step is honesty about what happened. Not sanitized history that mentions slavery as a footnote. not both sides' narratives that treat slaveholders and enslaved people as morally equivalent. Honest reckoning with the fact that respected families like the Yanceys built their wealth and status by owning human beings. Honest acknowledgement that the 131 births recorded in Bartlett Yancey's family Bible represent 131 people born into bondage, their lives controlled from birth by a system their oppressors defended as natural and right. The archive records survive, scattered across state libraries and historical societies. Fragmentary census data, estate inventories, wills distributing human beings, bills of sale, tax records, and family Bibles with sections titled Family Record of the Age of Negro Children. These documents tell a story that some people would prefer remained buried, but it's a story that must be told. Because behind every entry, every name, every transaction were human beings. People who built the houses we preserve as historical landmarks. People who cleared the land, planted the crops, cooked the food, raised the children, created the wealth that allowed people like the Yanceys to enter politics, fund education, and be remembered as distinguished statesmen. The Yancey family's legacy is American slavery's legacy. It's ordinary people committing extraordinary evil while convincing themselves they were doing nothing wrong. It's meticulous record-keeping of human property. It's political careers built on stolen labor. It's towns and counties named for slaveholders, celebrating their contributions while barely mentioning the people they exploited. It's a system so pervasive, so normalized, so legally and socially protected that it touched everything and everyone in the American South for 250 years. And it's also the legacy of the people whose names survive in those fragmentary records. Novel and Mary Frances, Jordan, Ellen, Charlotte and Martha, Moses and Jane, Phoebe and Bob, Alfred, Billy, who resisted and was sold south, Hannah, who lost her husband and son and then watched her other son torn away, all the others whose names we'll never know. They survived. They resisted. They maintained their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. They built families when families could be destroyed at any moment. They loved when love was dangerous. They endured when endurance seemed impossible. Their descendants live in America today, still dealing with slavery's aftermath, still fighting for the equality their ancestors were denied. The Yancey family's story is their story too. It's the story of how wealth was stolen and never returned, how families were torn apart and never reunited, how a system of absolute brutality was defended by people who saw themselves as civilized and decent, how that system's effects echo through generations, shaping the country we live in now. When you drive through Yanceyville, North Carolina, or visit Yancey County, you're in places named for a slaveholder. When you read about Joel Yancey corresponding with Thomas Jefferson, you're reading about a man who implemented Jefferson's breeding policies for enslaved women. When you see the Yancey name in genealogical records, you might be seeing descendants of slaveholders or descendants of enslaved people, both carrying the same name for very different reasons. This is American history. Not the sanitized version, not the comfortable narrative, but the complicated, brutal truth. And until we reckon with it fully, until we acknowledge how our present connects to this past, until we understand that respectable families built wealth through exploitation and that wealth still matters today, we're not really dealing with our history at all. We're just pretending it doesn't matter. But it does. It always has. And the 131 names in Bartlett Yancey's family Bible, the fragmentary estate records, the census data, the bills of sale, all of it tells us that it matters deeply. That behind the distinguished statesman was a slaveholder. That behind the public contributions was private exploitation. That behind the family name was a system of bondage that touched hundreds of lives across multiple generations. The Yancey family didn't act alone. They were part of a system. But they were active, willing participants in that system. They profited from it. They defended it. And when we tell their story, we must tell all of it. Not to condemn the descendants who bear no responsibility for their ancestors' actions, but to understand how slavery actually worked, who perpetuated it, how it was normalized and defended, and why its effects linger 160 years after abolition. That's the legacy. That's what we inherit. That's what we still must reckon with. And that reckoning begins with telling the truth about families like the Yanceys and the people they enslaved.